In the spring of 1982, a farmer named Owen Metcalf turned 60 sheep loose on 40 acres of pasture outside of Falmouth, Kentucky, and his neighbor Boyd Sexton drove to the fence line before the sun was down. "You're putting sheep on that pasture?" "60 head." "Owen, sheep destroy grass. Everybody knows that. They bite it to the root. They compact the soil with their hooves. They kill the clover. In 2 years, that pasture will be a dirt lot. You're taking 40 acres of decent grass and turning it into a parking lot. 60 sheep on 40 acres isn't overstocking, Boyd. That's 1.5 sheep per acre. The grass can handle that if I rotate." Rotate. That's the new word for ruining pasture in stages instead of all at once. "I'll bet you $500 that pasture is in better shape in 5 years than it is today." "I'll take that bet." "$500 says your grass is dead in 5 years. Not better. Dead." They shook hands across the fence. Owen sighed with 60 sheep spreading across the grass. Boyd sighed with 160 head of cattle on 300 acres of what Boyd considered the right way to manage pasture. Cattle, continuous grazing, and the chemical fertilizer program that the Extension Service had been promoting since the 1960s. Let me tell you about why Owen chose sheep, and why that choice was 40 years ahead of its time. Because the science behind what Owen was doing didn't have a name in 1982. It wouldn't have a name until the 1990s, when a Zimbabwean ecologist named Alan Savory published a book that described exactly what Owen's father had been practicing since the 1940s. Owen was born in 1941 in Pendleton County. His father, Harlan Metcalf, had been a sheep farmer, unusual in Kentucky cattle country, where sheep were considered an inferior animal by every measure the cattle industry used to judge livestock. Sheep were small, sheep were difficult, sheep required shearing, sheep attracted predators, and sheep, according to the universal wisdom of Kentucky cattlemen, destroyed pasture. The wisdom was wrong, or rather, the wisdom was incomplete. It was true that sheep grazed closer to the ground than cattle. Their mouths were smaller, their teeth sharper, and they could bite grass down to half an inch while cattle rarely grazed below 2 inches. On a continuously grazed pasture, where animals stayed on the same ground month after month without rest, sheep would graze the grass to nothing. The grass couldn't recover because the sheep never left. But Harlan Metcalf didn't graze continuously. He rotated. And the difference between continuous grazing and rotational grazing is the difference between mining and farming. One takes everything and leaves nothing. The other takes some and lets the rest grow back. Harlan's system was simple. He divided his 40 acres into 8 5-acre paddocks using portable electric fence. He put all 60 sheep in one paddock for 3 to 5 days, long enough for them to graze the grass down to 2 inches, but not long enough for them to kill the root crowns. Then he moved the entire flock to the next paddock, and the grazed paddock rested for 35 to 40 days before the sheep returned. The rest period was the key. When grass is grazed short and then left alone, it responds with what plant physiologists call compensatory growth. A burst of leaf and root production that's actually more vigorous than the growth of ungrazed grass. The plant dumps energy from its root reserves into new leaf tissue, growing faster than it would have if it had never been grazed at all. The grazing triggers the growth. The rest allows the growth. The cycle, graze, rest, produces a pasture that's more productive year after year, not less. But that's not all the sheep were doing. They were doing four things simultaneously that cattle couldn't match and that chemical fertilizer couldn't replicate. First, the sheep's close grazing removed the top growth uniformly. Every plant got cut to the same height, which meant every plant received equal sunlight when the regrowth started. No tall plants shading short ones. No competitive advantage for the aggressive species. The close grazing reset the canopy to zero and let every species start even. Second, the sheep's hooves, small, sharp, two-toed, broke the soil crust when they walked. On compacted pasture, rainfall runs off instead of soaking in. The sheep's hooves created thousands of small divots, micro-tillage, that caught rain, held it, and let it infiltrate into the root zone. After the sheep left a paddock, the first rain soaked into the broken crust instead of running off. More water in the soil meant more grass growth during the rest period. Third, the sheep deposited manure and urine uniformly across the paddock during their 3 to 5 day stay. Not in the corners, not along the fence, not in one spot by the water trough. Uniformly, because the electric fence and the rotation kept them moving across the entire paddock. The manure was small pellets, not the heavy pats that cattle deposited, which smothered grass underneath and took months to decompose. Sheep pellets were marble-sized, rich in nitrogen and potassium, and decomposed into the soil within 2 weeks. Free fertilizer distributed perfectly at no cost. Fourth, and this was the thing nobody expected, the sheep were controlling the fescue endophyte. Let me explain, because this is the science that Boyd Sexton didn't know and that the Extension Service wouldn't acknowledge for another 20 years. Kentucky's dominant pasture grass was tall fescue, a hardy, resilient grass that grew in most conditions and required minimal management. But most tall fescue in Kentucky was infected with an endophytic fungus that lived inside the plant's cells. The endophyte produced alkaloids, chemical compounds that were toxic to livestock. Cattle grazing endophyte-infected fescue suffered from a condition called fescue toxicosis. Reduced weight gain, poor heat tolerance, restricted blood flow to extremities, and reproductive problems. The condition was costing the Kentucky cattle industry an estimated $600 million per year in lost production. The cattle industry's solution was chemicals, feed additives, mineral supplements, and eventually the development of novel endophyte, fescue varieties that contained beneficial fungi instead of toxic ones. The replanting cost was enormous, $200 to $400 per acre to kill the existing fescue and establish the new variety. Owen's solution was sheep. Sheep were less susceptible to the fescue endophyte than cattle. Their rumen chemistry processed the alkaloids differently, and they experienced fewer symptoms. But more importantly, the rotational grazing system naturally weakened the endophyte-infected fescue and strengthened the competing grasses and legumes. Here's why. The endophyte fungus gave infected fescue a competitive advantage. The alkaloids made the plant taste bad, so livestock avoided it and grazed the non-infected grasses instead. On a continuously grazed pasture, the good grasses got eaten and the toxic fescue took over. It was natural selection in favor of the worst plant in the field, but under rotational grazing, the sheep ate everything in the paddock, including the infected fescue, because they were at high density for a short time and couldn't afford to be selective. Every plant got grazed equally. The toxic fescue lost its competitive advantage because it got eaten just as hard as the good grasses. During the rest period, the good grasses, orchard grass, bluegrass, clover, timothy, recovered faster than the fescue because their root systems were healthier in the improved soil. Over years, the pasture composition shifted, less toxic fescue, more diverse grasses and legumes. Owen knew this because Harlan had observed it over 30 years. By the time Harlan retired in 1974, his 40-acre pasture had shifted from 80% endophyte-infected fescue to approximately 40% fescue, 25% orchard grass, 20% clover, and 15% bluegrass and other species. The diversity was visible. The pasture wasn't a monoculture of one grass species. It was a meadow. Multiple species at multiple heights, blooming at different times, providing nutrition year-round instead of the seasonal flush and fade of a pure fescue stand. Owen inherited the system in 1974 and continued it. By 1982, when he shook Boyd's hand on the $500 bet, the pasture had been under rotational sheep, grazing for nearly 40 years. The grass was the best in Pendleton County by every measure: density, species diversity, drought tolerance, and the simple visual test that any farmer could apply by looking over the fence, but Boyd couldn't see it. Boyd saw sheep and thought, destruction, because that's what every cattleman in Kentucky had been taught. Sheep ruin pastures. It was gospel. It was catechism. It was wrong. Let me tell you about the 5-year bet, because Owen won it, and the 10-year results are what made the soil scientist drive from Lexington. 1983, year 1 after the bet. Owen rotated his 60 sheep through the 8 paddocks on schedule. Boyd ran his 160 cattle on 300 acres of continuous pasture with a standard nitrogen fertilizer program. 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre in spring, 40 in fall, $4,200 per year in fertilizer cost. Owen's fertilizer cost, $0. The sheep were the fertilizer. 1984. Boyd's pasture looked the same as always. Green in spring, stressed in summer, faded in fall, solid fescue, uniform and toxic. His cattle gained 1.8 pounds per day on average, below the county average of 2.1 because the fescue toxicosis was suppressing their performance. Owen's pasture looked different. The clover was increasing. Visible patches of white flowers among the grass, spreading every year as the rotational grazing gave it room to establish. The orchard grass was thickening. The overall density, the number of plants per square foot, was measurably higher than Boyd's because the diverse species filled different niches in the soil and the canopy instead of all competing for the same resources. 1985, drought. Pendleton County got 8 inches of rain from April through August, instead of the normal 18. Boyd's continuous pasture browned by June. The fescue, despite its reputation for hardiness, went dormant in the heat, and with no diversity to fill the gap, the pasture was bare dirt by August. Boyd hauled hay from July through October, $3,800 in purchased feed on top of his $4,200 fertilizer bill. Owen's pasture browned on top, but stayed green at the base. The diverse root systems reached different depths. The clover fixed nitrogen that the grasses needed, and the improved soil structure from years of hoof-broken crust held more water per inch of rain than Boyd's compacted surface. Owen fed no hay until September. His total feed cost during the drought, $600, 1987, the 5-year mark. Owen invited Boyd to walk the pasture. Boyd brought his cattleman's eye and his cattleman's prejudice, and both failed him within 50 feet. The grass was thick, not just thick, lush. The kind of pasture that a cattleman sees in a magazine and assumes was photographed in New Zealand. Multiple species, multiple heights, white clover blooming at the base, orchard grass heading in the sun, the remnant fescue still present but no longer dominant. The soil under the grass was dark, crumbly, alive with earthworms. Owen turned a shovelful to show Boyd, and the worm count was visible without counting. 15, 20 worms in one spade of earth. Boyd's pasture, if you turned a shovelful, would show 2 or 3. "This is the grass you said would be dead," Owen said. Boyd looked at the pasture. He looked at his own pasture across the fence. Solid fescue, chemically fertilized, grazed continuously. The grass shorter and thinner, despite the nitrogen supplements. The two pastures shared a fence line. Same rainfall, same soil type, same sunlight, different management. And the difference was visible from space. One side dark green and dense, the other side pale green and thin. "The sheep didn't destroy it," Boyd said. "The sheep improved it. The grazing triggers the growth. The rest allows the recovery. The hooves break the crust. The manure feeds the soil. The rotation shifts the species mix from toxic fescue to diverse meadow. The sheep are doing what the bison used to do. Graze hard, move on, don't come back for a month. That's how grasslands evolved. That's what grass is designed for. I've been fertilizing for 20 years. You haven't fertilized once. I haven't needed to. 60 sheep produce approximately 30 tons of manure per year. Distributed uniformly across 40 acres by the rotation. That's 1,500 pounds per acre of high nitrogen organic fertilizer. Your chemical program applies 100 pounds of synthetic nitrogen per acre. My sheep apply more nitrogen than your fertilizer, plus phosphorus, plus potassium, plus organic matter, plus the biological activity from the dung beetles and earthworms that feed on the manure. The chemical approach gives you one nutrient. The sheep give you the whole system. Boyd paid the $500. He paid it at the farm gate, in cash, standing on grass that he'd predicted would be dead, and that was, by any honest assessment, the healthiest pasture in Pendleton County. Let me tell you about the soil scientist, because the 10-year results attracted a researcher from the University of Kentucky who came to Falmouth expecting to confirm what the cattlemen believed, and left with data that contradicted everything the Extension Service had been teaching. In 1992, Dr. Helen Marsh, a soil ecologist from the UK College of Agriculture in Lexington, heard about the Metcalfe pasture from a county extension agent who'd been forced to acknowledge, after 10 years of watching, that something unusual was happening on Owen's 40 acres. The agent had tested the grass composition and found that Owen's pasture contained 17 species of grass and legume, the most diverse pasture he'd recorded in Pendleton County. The standard fescue pasture averaged 3 species. Dr. Marsh drove to Falmouth in July of 1992. She spent 3 days on the farm, collecting soil cores, measuring infiltration rates, counting earthworms, analyzing forage composition, and comparing Owen's rotationally grazed sheep pasture with Boyd's continuously grazed cattle pasture across the fence. The data was unambiguous. Soil organic matter, Owen's Pasture, 5.8%. Boyd's Pasture, 2.9%. Owen's soil contained twice the organic matter, which meant twice the water-holding capacity, twice the nutrient availability, and twice the biological activity. Water infiltration rate. Owen's Pasture absorbed 4.2 inches of rain per hour. Boyd's absorbed 1.1 inches per hour. Owen's soil soaked up water 4 times faster, meaning less runoff, less erosion, more moisture held in the root zone during drought. Earthworm count. Owen's Pasture, 24 per square foot. Boyd's, 3 per square foot. 8 times more earthworms, each one processing organic matter, aerating the soil, creating channels for water and root penetration. Forage production. Owen's Pasture produced 6,400 pounds of dry matter per acre per year. Boyd's produced 4,100 pounds, and Boyd was applying $105 per acre in chemical fertilizer, while Owen applied nothing. Endophyte infection rate. Owen's Pasture. 22% of fescue plants were endophyte infected. Boyd's, 89%. Owen's rotation had reduced the toxic fescue by 3/4 without a single chemical application or replanting. Dr. Marsh published a case study in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in 1993. The paper was titled, Long-Term Rotational Sheep Grazing Effects on Pasture Composition, Soil Health, and Endophyte Prevalence in Central Kentucky. It compared the two pastures, same soil, same county, same rainfall, different management, and concluded that intensive rotational grazing with sheep produced measurable improvements in every soil health parameter measured, while simultaneously reducing toxic endophyte prevalence without chemical intervention. The paper named both farms. It named the 40-year management history. It named the species diversity, 17 species on Owen's Pasture versus 3 on Boyd's. It named the earthworm count, and it named the cost. Owen's annual fertilizer expense was $0. Boyd's was $4,200. The John Deere dealer in Falmouth, a man named Earl Perkins, read the paper, or rather heard about the paper at the co-op, which is how dealers learn things they don't want to learn. The university is writing papers about Owen Metcalf's sheep. Apparently, sheep manure is better than nitrogen. Owen's Pasture is the best in the county, and he hasn't bought fertilizer since Carter was president. Earl had been selling equipment and recommending fertilizer programs to Pendleton County farmers for 19 years. His business depended on a model where pasture required annual chemical inputs, fertilizer, lime, herbicide, each of which required equipment to apply, each of which required financing, each of which generated revenue for the dealership. A farmer who needed no fertilizer needed no spreader. A farmer who needed no spreader needed no financing. A farmer who needed no financing was a farmer who didn't need Earl Perkins. Earl drove to the Metcalf farm in the fall of 1993. He found Owen in the pasture, moving the electric fence to open a new paddock. The sheep flooded through the gap, 60 woolly bodies spreading across fresh grass, their heads down, grazing with the focused intensity of animals that knew the grass would be available for 3 days and then gone. Owen, Earl, the university published a paper about your pasture. Dr. Marsh told me she would. It says your soil has twice the organic matter of Boyd's, 4 times the water infiltration, 8 times the earthworms, and you don't buy fertilizer. I haven't bought fertilizer since 1974. The sheep do the work. I've been selling fertilizer and lime and spreaders to this county for 19 years, and 60 sheep on 40 acres are doing the same job, better, for free. Not free. I shear 60 sheep every spring. That's $600 in wool. I sell lambs every fall. That's $3,000 to $4,000 in meat revenue. The sheep aren't just fertilizing the pasture. They're paying me to fertilize it. Your fertilizer costs money to buy, money to apply, and money to finance. My fertilizer earns money while it works. Earl looked at the sheep. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the fence line where Owen's lush, diverse meadow met Boyd's pale, thin fescue. The visual was irrefutable. One side was alive. The other side was surviving. I sell tractors and fertilizer spreaders. Your sheep don't need either one. My Farmall 560 moves the fence. That's the only equipment I use. The sheep do everything else. A 1960 Farmall 560. That tractor is older than most of my customers. And the pasture is healthier than any of their fields. The age of the tractor doesn't matter. The age of the system does. My father started this rotation in 1942. That's 51 years of soil building. You can't replicate 51 years of biology with a fertilizer spreader. Let me tell you about Boyd's conversion, because it happened in 1995, and it's the reconciliation this story has been building toward for 13 years. Boyd Sexton had been watching Owen's pasture for 13 years since the bet. He'd paid the $500. He'd acknowledged the grass was better. He'd read the university paper, but switching from cattle to sheep, or even adding sheep to his cattle operation, felt like admitting that everything he'd been doing for 30 years was wrong. And Boyd was a cattleman. His father was a cattleman. His grandfather was a cattleman. Sheep were, in the cattleman's worldview, the enemy of good grass. The drought of 1995 broke him. Same pattern as 1985. Hot, dry. The fescue going dormant by June. The continuous pasture turning brown, while Owen's diverse meadow held green into August. Boyd hauled hay again. $4,400 in purchased feed. Owen fed no hay until October. The cost disparity was agonizing. $4,400 plus $4,200 in fertilizer on Boyd's side. Zero on Owen's. Boyd drove to Owen's farm in September of 1995. Owen was in the barn shearing a late lamb. The wool came off in one piece, a clean white fleece that Owen folded carefully and set in a bin. "I want to learn your system," Boyd said. No preamble, no excuse, no face-saving disclaimer, just the statement. Owen set down the shears. "You want to run sheep." "I want to do what you do, rotation paddocks, the whole thing. I'm spending $8,400 a year on fertilizer and purchased hay to maintain pasture that a university study says is half as good as yours. You spend nothing, and your pasture is the best in the county. I'm tired of being wrong. You'll need electric fence, portable posts, and polywire. I'll show you the paddock layout, and you'll need sheep. I'm not replacing all my cattle. You don't have to. Run sheep and cattle together. The sheep graze the grass, close. The cattle graze the taller material. They complement each other. Different mouth heights, different grazing patterns, different parasite cycles. Running both species together produces better pasture than either one alone. Boyd bought 30 sheep from a breeder in Fleming County that fall. Owen helped him set up the paddock rotation on 100 of Boyd's 300 acres. A trial, a test. The cautious first step of a cattleman learning to trust an animal he'd spent his life dismissing. The first-year results were visible by the following July. The 100 acres under rotation were greener, thicker, and more diverse than the 200 acres still under continuous cattle grazing. The clover was establishing, the earthworms were increasing, the soil was softening, the system was working. The same system that had worked on Owen's 40 acres for 53 years, now crossing the fence line to the neighbor, who'd bet $500 against it. By 1998, Boyd had expanded the rotation to all 300 acres. His fertilizer purchases dropped to zero. His hay purchases dropped by 70%. His cattle gained weight faster on the diverse pasture than they ever had on the fescue monoculture, 2.4 pounds per day, versus the 1.8 they'd been gaining, because the reduced endophyte infection and the improved forage quality were giving the cattle what the chemical program never could: food that didn't make them sick. Let me tell you about the county-wide impact, because by 2001, the Metcalf system had spread beyond the two farms. Dr. Marsh returned to Pendleton County in 1998 for a follow-up study. This time she measured both the Metcalf and the Sexton pastures. Owen's 40 acres under 56 years of rotation, and Boyd's 300 acres under 3 years of rotation. The results showed that even 3 years of the system produced measurable improvements. Soil organic matter up 0.4%, infiltration rate doubled, earthworm count tripled, endophyte prevalence down from 89 to 68%. The follow-up paper attracted attention from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the federal agency responsible for soil conservation programs. An NRCS agent visited Falmouth in 1999 and recommended the Metcalf rotational system as a best management practice for Kentucky pasture land. The recommendation came with cost-share funding, federal money to help farmers install the portable fencing infrastructure needed for paddock rotation. By 2001, 11 farms in Pendleton County had adopted some form of rotational grazing. Not all with sheep. Some used cattle-only rotation, which captured some but not all of the benefits Owen's sheep provided. The county's average pasture quality, as measured by the Extension Service's annual forage survey, had improved measurably, up 14% in dry matter production and 22% in species diversity over the pre-rotation baseline. Owen continued farming until 2006, when he retired at 65. His son, Kyle, runs the operation today. The same 40 acres, the same rotation, the same 8-paddock system, with adjustments for flock size and seasonal conditions. The Farmall 560 is in the barn. The sheep are in the pasture. The grass is still the healthiest in the county. The university published a third paper in 2004. A 22-year longitudinal study of the Metcalf pasture that documented the cumulative effects of multi-generational rotational sheep grazing on soil health. The paper found that Owen's soil organic matter had reached 6.4%, more than 3 times the county average of 2.1%. The carbon sequestration rate was estimated at 1.2 tons of carbon per acre per year, meaning Owen's 40-acre pasture was pulling 48 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere annually. The soil was not just healthy, it was actively improving the climate. Boyd Sexton died in 2003. His son, Travis, farms the 300 acres with the rotation that Owen taught Boyd in 1995. Travis runs sheep and cattle together. He hasn't bought fertilizer since 1998. He told Kyle Metcalf at the co-op that the best $500 his father ever spent was the bet he lost in 1982. Earl Perkins retired from the J.D. dealership in 2000. His successor added fencing supplies to the store, portable posts, polywire, energizers. The equipment that replaced the fertilizer spreader in Pendleton County was sold by the same dealership that had been selling the fertilizer. Earl's successor said it was the fastest growing product line in the store. Let me ask you something. What are you fertilizing that could fertilize itself? Boyd Sexton spent $4,200 a year on nitrogen for 30 years. That's $126,000 in fertilizer. Synthetic, petroleum-based, applied with equipment that cost another $15,000 over its lifetime. He fed the soil the way a factory feeds a machine. One input, measured, controlled, purchased annually. Owen Metcalf spent nothing, zero. His sheep produced 30 tons of organic fertilizer per year, distributed uniformly, decomposed naturally, and paid for themselves with wool and meat income. His total investment was 60 sheep, some electric fence, and the patience to let a system work that his father had started before Owen was born. The neighbor bet $500 that the sheep would destroy the pasture. 10 years later, it was the healthiest grass in the county, because the sheep weren't destroying the pasture. They were doing what grass evolved to expect, being grazed hard and then left alone. The cycle that made the Great Plains the most fertile grassland on earth before the plow turned it over. Graze, rest, graze, rest. The rhythm that 1,000 years of bison had established and that one farmer with 60 sheep had the wisdom to replicate. The neighbor saw destruction. The farmer saw a cycle. The cycle won.